Reform in France was on by 1789. The feudal system had been abolished by the August decrees, and the ground had been prepared for the creation of a constitution. Following this, the deputies drew up the principles on which this should all be based, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It condemned the practices of the ancient regime and outlined the rights of the citizens as demanded in the cahiers of all three orders. After October 1789, most French people believed that the revolution was over. For the next year, there was broad agreement amongst the different groups in the Assembly as they set about reorganizing how France was governed, its legal system and finances, taxes, and the economy of the country would be reorganized. The Assembly tried to apply the principles of the Declaration of Rights to give France a uniform, decentralized, representative, and humanitarian system which treated people equally and with dignity. Many of the deputies regarded themselves as products of the Enlightenment and as such sought to end cruelty, superstition, and poverty. Most people by the end of 1789 wanted a constitutional monarchy, and there were few regrets about the passing of the ancient regime. France was fundamentally changed in many ways. New structures, such as the departments, were created that have survived until the present day. The deputies in the National Assembly set about their task of reforming France with considerable dedication. While most people wanted and waited in anticipation for reforms, which they hoped would improve their lives, many in the privileged classes prepared themselves for the worst. The main area of changes would be local government, taxation and finance, the economy, the legal system, the church, and the Constitution. The reforms to the local government involved significantly restructuring it. In restructuring local government, the deputies wanted to make sure the power was decentralized, passing from the central government in Paris to local authorities. This would make it much more difficult for the king to recover the power he had held before the revolution. It was hoped that administrative chaos of the ancient regime would be replaced by a coherent structure. The reforms which revealed the real intention of the Assembly related to voting qualifications. It became clear that the deputies did not intend that those who had taken part in the popular protests should have a direct role in government. A law in December 1789 introduced the concept of active citizens, of which there were three tiers: men over 25 who paid the equivalent of 3 days' labor and local taxes. It was estimated in 1790 that almost 4.3 million Frenchmen fell into this category. Citizens who did not pay this amount of tax had no vote and were known as passive citizens. In reality, the only thing active citizens could do was to choose electors, the second tier. Electors are active citizens who pay the equivalent of 10 days of labor and local taxes. About 50,000 men met this qualification, and they elected members of the canton and department assemblies and become officials there. They also elected the deputies to the National Assembly, the third tier. To be eligible to become a deputy in the National Assembly, an active citizen had to pay at least a silver mark, the equivalent to 54 days of manual labor and direct taxation. This was way beyond the reach of most Frenchmen. The electoral system was therefore heavily weighted in the favor of the wealthy. In the South, bourgeoisie landowners controlled the new councils. In the North, the bourgeoisie was largely urban and took office in the towns, which left the rural communes in the hands of the laborers, small merchants and artisans. People belonging to social groups which had never held any public office now had the opportunity of doing so. It is estimated that in the decade of 1789 to 99, about 1 million people were elected to councils and gained experience in local administration. After the royal administration collapsed in 1789, very few taxes were collected. The Assembly needed money quickly, particularly when it decided that church office holders should be compensated for the loss of their offices. Yet a new tax system could not be set up immediately, as considerable planning would be required before any new systems could be created. It was decided that the existing system of direct and indirect taxation should continue in 1791. This was very unpopular. As a first step of dealing with this financial crisis, church land was nationalized in November 1789. The National Assembly had three reasons for doing this. First, they wanted to provide money for the state. Second, they wanted to guarantee the success of the revolution. And third, it was hoped that the clergy would now support the new regime, as they would be dependent on it for new salaries. While a lot of the land was bought by the bourgeoisie, it is often estimated that a number of peasant smallholders and landowners increased by 1 million between the years of 1789 and 1810. Before reforms were introduced for taxes, they abolished a lot of the old unpopular taxes like indirect taxes, like the state monopoly on growing and selling tobacco, and some of those old direct taxes from the Middle Ages. The new financial system came into effect in January 1791 and established some new taxes that would go immediately to funding the government. In line with the principle of equality, citizens would pay according to their ability to do so. It was planned that the new taxes would be collected by the municipal councils. This system might have worked well if there had been a systematic valuation of the land, but for this, a large number of officials were needed. The assembly would not provide them as they would cost too much. Consequently, a survey of land values was not begun until 1807 and was not completed until the 1830s. During the ancient regime, many commentators noted how limited French economic progress was when compared with the rapid developments taking place in Great Britain. They viewed the restrictive social structures and internal barriers as inhibiting economic development. The revolution presented opportunities for reform. All the deputies in the Constituent Assembly believed in laissez-faire. Therefore, they introduced free trade in grain in August 1789 and removed price controls. These measures were extended to other products in 1790 and 91, though this was not what the people as a whole desired. They wanted the price and distribution of all essential goods to be controlled in order to avoid scarcity, high prices, and possible starvation. In October 1790, internal tariffs were abolished, so a national market was created for the first time. The deputies were determined to get rid of any organization which had special privileges and restrictions regarding employment. The aim was to open up a range of crafts and occupations to more people. Guilds were therefore abolished in 1791, as they had restricted the entry of people into certain trades in order to ensure that wage levels and prices charged for goods and services had remained high. In June 1791, a coalition of 80,000 Parisian workers was threatening a general strike to obtain higher wages, so the Assembly passed a series of laws in which it forbade trade unions and employers' organizations. Collective bargaining, picketing, and strikes were declared illegal. No one in the Assembly objected to this measure. Strikes remained illegal until 1864, and the ban on trade unions was not lifted until 1884. The Assembly regarded relief for the poor as a duty of the state. The Church had provided what little assistance the poor had received, but it could not do so any longer when its land was sold and it lost its main source of income. Therefore, there was an urgent need for a national organization financed by taxation to take over this role. The Assembly set up a committee which in 1791 showed for the first time just how serious the problem was. It concluded that nearly 2 million people could support themselves only by begging. When it came to taking practical measures to help the poor, the committee found itself impossible to solve the problem. There was simply not enough money available to deal with such an appalling situation, so nothing was done. The Constituent Assembly applied the same principle of uniformity to the legal system. The main features of the new system was each canton there was to be a justice of the peace. The justice's main task was to persuade the different parties to come to an agreement. Serious civil cases such as property disputes were dealt with in a district court. A criminal court would be located in each department where trials would be held in public before a jury. At the head of the judicial system was the Court of the Appeal, and all judges were elected by active citizens. There were other improvements in the quality of French justice. The penal code was made more humane. Torture and mutilation were abolished. Anyone arrested had to be brought before a court within 24 hours, and the number of capital crimes was vastly reduced. In March 1792, a new and more efficient method of execution, the guillotine, was approved by the Legislative Assembly. Yeah, they keep changing the name. You're just going to have to get used to it, kids. So now the Legislative Assembly introduced the guillotine. It replaced all other forms used which had condemned those to death. This mechanical device had an angular blade, which would become one of the most feared and lasting images of the Revolution. The new judicial system was to prove one of the most lasting reforms of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly wanted to create a church that was free from abuses such as absenteeism and plurality, free from foreign control like from the Pope, democratic and linked to the new system of local government. The deputies were not in the main anti-religious or even anti-Catholic and simply wanted to extend to religion the principles they applied elsewhere. They certainly had no intention of interfering with the doctrines of the church or with its spiritual functions. There was no serious conflict with the Church until the civil constitution of the clergy was approved in July 1790. This measure reformed the Catholic Church in France and adopted the organization of the Church to the administration framework of local governments. Dioceses were to coincide with the departments. This meant that the number of bishops would be reduced from 135 to 83. There would not only be fewer bishops, but fewer clergy generally, as all other clerical posts, except for parish priests and bishops, ceased to exist. The attempt to extend democracy to all aspects of government was also applied to the Church, but there was no intention of ending the Catholic Church's position as the state church in France. Some of the key terms of the civil constitution of the clergy was each department would form a single diocese, and there would be no recognition of any bishop appointed by the Pope. All titles and offices other than those mentioned in the civil constitution were abolished. All priests and bishops were to be elected to their posts, and all elections were to be by ballot and by absolute majority of those who voted. Priests were to be paid by the state, and there was to be no absenteeism. Most clergy opposed the principle of election, which was unknown in the church, but even so, the majority were in favor of finding a way of accepting the civil constitution and avoiding a split in the church. They demanded that the reforms be submitted to a national synod of the French church. This would have made a compromise possible, but the Constituent Assembly would not agree to this, as it believed it would give the church a privileged position. As the church was not allowed to discuss the matter, the clergy waited for the Pope to give his verdict. He delayed coming to a decision as he was involved in delicate negotiation with the French over the status of Avignon. The Assembly grew tired of waiting and in November 1790 declared that the clergy must take an oath to the Constitution. This split the clergy. The civil constitution of the clergy had momentous results. It was one of the defining moments of the Revolution. It effectively destroyed the revolutionary consensus that existed since 1789. Deputies in the Assembly were shocked when it was rejected by so many clergy and by the Pope. There were now in effect two Catholic churches in France. One was the Constitutional Church, which accepted the Revolution but was rejected by Rome. The other was a non-juring church of refractory priests, approved by the Pope but regarded by the patriots as rejecting the Revolution. Dissatisfaction with the Revolution, which eventually turned into civil war, was therefore one result of the civil constitution of the clergy. Another was the king's attempt to flee from France in June 1791, precipitating a series of events which was to bring about the downfall of the monarchy. One of the main aims of the Constituent Assembly had been to draw up a constitution. It's ironic, by the time they agreed to everything, they've already overthrown the monarchy. But a lot of these things were agreed early in 1789. For instance, under the terms of the Constitution, a king had the right to appoint his own ministers and military commanders. He was also given a suspension veto. He was dependent on the Assembly for his foreign policy, and he also had to agree that the office was hereditary, though subordinate to the Assembly. In September, Louis XVI reluctantly accepted the Constitution. Marie Antoinette's attitude was that it was so monstrous that it cannot survive for long. She was determined to overthrow it at the first opportunity.